You are now tuned into the Hip Hop Learners Podcast, a place for conversations on hip hop literature, both scholarly as well as general audiences. Before we begin today, I would just like to take a moment out to let you all know that the podcast is now available on all platforms, all major platforms anyhow. This has been the case for a couple weeks now, however I did end up forgetting to give you guys an update in the last episode, so as of now, you can listen to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Alexa devices through TuneCore, as well as through the OG Podbean network where the show is hosted. I'd really appreciate it if you can give the podcast a thumbs up or a like on whichever platform you are tuned into. It helps the show grow, and which in turn will end up keeping this a more active thing down the road. So, getting into today's podcast, today's guest is yet another Canadian hip-hop scholar, this time by the name of Dr. Charity Marsh. Charity is a professor at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, and in the past she has written extensively on indigenous studies within Canada and has contributed to some of the most seminal texts on Canadian hip-hop, generally within the confines of indigenous hip-hop, as well as the role gender has to play in hip-hop as well. In 2020, Charity, alongside Mark V. Campbell, edited and published the first scholarly collection on Canadian hip-hop to date under the name We Still Hear Hip-Hop North of the 49th Parallel. In this podcast, we discuss the collection and the process of putting something like this together, as well as her own contributions to the collection that she has authored. This was a very exciting and thought-provoking conversation for me, and I hope you all enjoy it as well. Lastly, before we begin, Dr. Marsh would like to acknowledge that she lives, works, plays, and parents 2 kiddos on Treaty 4 lands. Treaty 4 is home to the Nêhiyawak, Anihšināpēk, Lakota, Dakota, Nakoda peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Peoples. I just wanted to start by congratulating you on the publication of the new book. For those listening at home, it's called We Still Hear Hip-Hop North of the 49th Parallel. It's an edited collection of essays on Canadian hip-hop, edited by yourself, Charity Marsh, and Mark V. Campbell. It's a fascinating read-through. I think it's a really important addition to the work being done here on Canadian hip-hop, so congratulations and thank you for putting this one together.
Thank you. It's definitely been an exciting work and a lengthy but important process.
Yeah, I've been working on my project. I said this kind of before we started, but since January of 2018, and I've recognized a lot of the issues that are brought up within the contents of the book, but I've recognized the challenge of putting something like this together. This is an area that's really underdeveloped and underappreciated. There hasn't really been a whole lot of work on this subject. So going through and kind of building your own primary sources and kind of doing grassroots research in a lot of ways rather than looking at a series of secondary sources that are already available on the subject is quite a different way of doing research, I think, than a lot of other areas or disciplines. And it's rewarding, but it's challenging. And I think I, to some degree, at the very least, recognize what putting something like this together kind of means. So it's hard work, but again, thank you. As somebody that's actually working on Canadian hip hop and is always looking to learn more about Canadian hip hop, a book like this is right, not only right up my alley, but I just think it's incredible to be able to get my hands on something like this and get my hands on it while I'm still working on my project. It's not like it came out 10 years afterwards or anything. This is right when I'm the most interested in this subject material, and it's been a blast to be able to go through. So again, I'll say this 1,000 times, I'm sure, throughout the conversation, but thank you. It's been quite the joy.
I think that there is, in talking about the need or thinking about the way we did research, and I think a number of the authors, it's very evident the contributors here, a lot of them are hands-on in community-based hip-hop arts projects or programs, and that work definitely takes time to sit back. Once you build your relationships, you engage in the actual program or project, and then you sit back and reflect. So I think the length of time or how that research comes about is indeed very it's a longer process than other kinds of research for sure, but certainly rewarding and rich. And that is one of the things I'm very I'm very proud about in this, in this book is that a lot of that comes through in many of the chapters and from the work of many of the contributors, which is it's always exciting to see research coming out of community initiatives, and often at the request or at those kernels, that primary need or want or desire of this work comes from the community, and that's key.
100%. I will have introduced you more formally during the introduction for the podcast itself, but I wanted to get a little bit more of a background on how you kind of arrived here. Even before this collection was edited and published, you had published on hip-hop studies prior. What kind of got you interested in hip-hop studies and the culture as a point of study? What's your background with hip-hop?
Okay, so with hip-hop, it's interesting. Certainly I grew up loving hip-hop, but one of the things initially I did and spent a lot of time in my master's and my PhD was really focusing on other kinds of music. So my MA was really focused on Björk's 1997 album Homogenic. And then for my PhD research, it was focused on, I was in Toronto, it was that time, and it was really focused on rave culture and what was happening and the policing of rave culture in that period of 1999, 2000. And so what happened, though, for me around a shift in research, I was coming to the end of that project, but I was hired at the University of Regina. And so I moved from Toronto to Regina, Saskatchewan, and when I arrived here, I was one of the first, if not the first, popular music scholar that had been hired in the province. And so I think people were pretty excited about the possibilities, and one of the things that happened immediately, as soon as I basically drove across the country and landed, was I was asked about the kinds of research I do and if I would be willing to do research around hip-hop, and in particular hip-hop through an indigenous lens. And primarily I was asked by a lot of different stakeholders, whether they were teachers or social workers or health practitioners or community members, elders, even policing, around questions that were specifically around hip-hop and the relationship of hip-hop with Indigenous youth here in this place. And so as a person who is a community-based researcher, I was a new person in this community, new to this land, to treaty here where we are in Saskatchewan. So to be asked for a very particular kind of research by the community within which I had now engaged was really important. And it allowed me a sense of, okay, so here as a researcher, here's a way that I can come into this community and give back to the community and engage and build relationships with the people here that maybe would put me on a path that actually made sense for this place, that particular time. As I said, I was coming to the end of a very large project that I had spent 5 or 6 years on. It was time for something new, and it was time to think about how I was going to make a home in this new location. And to be asked by so many different people, so many different stakeholders, and then to be asked specifically by one group, a high school here in the city, to help build a hip hop project, to build curriculum that would be engaged and used, embedded within a high school here, Scott Collegiate. It was an important step in place for me to begin here. And so as a researcher, as a music lover and fan all my life, it wasn't when I began the sort of scholarly academic path, I didn't necessarily think about that I would be doing research on hip hop.
Sure.
But I think that's a really important moment as a researcher to engage in sort of an ethical process of creating new relations and bringing something and serving the communities within which I was now located. And so to me, that was key. And it's what has led me now on this. That was since 2004. So here we are, 2021. That's how long I have been researching and writing and thinking about and engaged in hip hop, particularly from a community-based platform. And so building hip hop programs, opening up my interactive media and performance labs, the IMP labs, which are often referred to as the hip hop labs. So, and in that, thinking about that place, thinking about the IMP labs and how I wanted to create this space, it was really thinking about how can I create a research space, but that is completely open to anyone in the community, that becomes a kind of gathering place for people of all ages engaged in hip-hop or other kinds of creative practices, music making. And so as part of my research program, this much larger research program, I built labs that had, an interactive DJ studio, beat making labs. We ran a series of workshops, which are still running all these years later, where we facilitate knowledge for anyone that around how to make a beat, how to write a rap, how to DJ, how to dance, how to engage in all kinds of processes that were specifically geared, one, towards hip hop and then other kinds of popular music forms. So it really was a sort of a domino effect. I arrived, I was asked by the community, and then from that place, I built a research program that made sense and where the questions were coming from the communities, in particular from a lot of the indigenous communities that I worked with and other communities that I worked with that were very specific kinds of questions to look at. And then, of course, building programs and projects and working with so many young people and facilitating workshops, working with artists that were so generous and open and excited, and then, and creating the resources, the infrastructure to do that work, to do that sort of labor of love and passionate, a place where you had, even in the community, the IMP Labs community program that I still have running, however, differently right now because of COVID, I have to say. We're not. It's like very strange. However, in the regular time is it is a place where you have, very talented professional musicians working alongside amateurs or people who've never touched the gear or written a beat or, and it's beautiful. And you see this kind of really important improvisation and play that happens. And that is, that was really the beginning of my work in hip-hop research specifically.
I find it fascinating that it seems like both of the paths that you're kind of immersed in as of now seem to have almost been kind of placed onto you in a way, and now you kind of find yourself at an intersection of both Indigenous studies and hip-hop studies, and I don't know. I find that fascinating. Not only do I find it fascinating, but I find it fascinating that you end up going from Toronto to Saskatoon, and you end up finding this kind of new research kind of landscape there in Saskatchewan. Sorry, you're located over Regina, not Saskatoon, but out of the province anyhow. And as I've been going through my work, one of the things that I found just incredible was the community in Saskatchewan in terms of the hip hop community. That was something that I didn't know. It wasn't even something that I ever would have expected or anticipated. I kind of went into this project not knowing a whole lot about Canadian hip hop, but I was kind of within the music journalism sphere anyhow, and had known of some artists here and there, and I knew that there was a scene in Manitoba, and specifically in Brandon because of Peanuts and Corn and what McEnroe and a lot of those guys had done, and I knew that there was a little bit of scene in Winnipeg with Freak Show and some of those artists, but I really didn't know a whole lot about Canadian hip hop, and I would have thought maybe Toronto. I knew that there was a scene in Halifax as well in the early 2000s, late 90s with Anticon and Buck 65 and 6-2. So I knew that there was a scene there. I knew there was a scene in Vancouver with Battle Axe. So I kind of had in my mind where the project was going to end up going, and it was very quickly into the project that I realized that, wait, I have to redraw my map of how I want this thing to look, because there was a couple different areas that I just didn't expect. But the major one was specifically Saskatoon, but Saskatchewan as a whole just had a really, really rich hip-hop scene that was going on for so long. I find it amazing that when you went there, that you were the first popular music scholar to kind of be working within that field in the province, because now that I'm so immersed into this kind of field in this project, I see that Saskatchewan as a province has large music roots. It's something that's been very kind of prevalent there for a very, very long time, and they've made huge impacts in the scene nationally and probably internationally in a lot of ways. Think of people, even the hip-hop scene in Saskatoon, like Factor, and what Side Road Records has done, selling overseas in Germany and Japan, and having people like Epic go over and do records in Russia, for example. There's clearly a scene there. I don't know. I find your story fascinating, nevertheless.
I would say too, it's really one of the things that I hear and I think about too is in the way scenes are understood and acknowledged and represented. And of course, right, I think there's also something to be said for thinking about the prairie provinces as this flyover province, and that they're not like these massive urban centers. Sure. And so we still have this sort of, strange idea that hip hop has to be or has been connected historically to these urban centers. So yes, Toronto, Vancouver, for sure, we have that. Almost like even a sense of East-West that plays out. But I mean, if you look, like, yes, the richness of what has been happening in pockets, especially across the prairies, and I would say, there's an entire group of young folks. They were initially, when they began, they're young people that gravitated towards hip hop, and in particular, sort of more that kind of political based hip hop. I mean, those are very hard generalizations to make, like thinking about how we understand that. But I don't want to say underground because that doesn't work very well either. But this kind of politics of resistance, the politics of like taking up and thinking about these sort of problem, like inequalities and social justice kinds of concerns and issues. And so, yes, you get a number of things happening there in the production, some really big things, like, of course, you talked about Factor, etc. But even drawing on, like, people like Equal, like Lindsay Knight, and the ongoing work that she has contributed to the sort of political music and the music scene in Saskatchewan, across the prairies, and then, of course, often recognized much more internationally. And this is one of the things I think we still struggle with in lots of genres in across Canada, where there's less of a recognition maybe here at home, like across the nation or around the nation, I should say, not just across, but then, of course, recognized internationally differently and acknowledged and celebrated differently. But one of the things there, the other thing I'm thinking about, and I think, the reason I bring up Lindsay, for example, is like what else we saw. So when I talk, and I've talked with Lindsay quite a lot, and thinking about her role models, and not just like within the sort of the mythology or the history of hip hop in the way that we think, because certainly there are all of those. We talk about the cassette tapes and like hearing them and being blown away. And then, of course, she talks about how that impacted her. But even like role models for her, like Alita Kinney Starr, right? And thinking about Alita's contribution to hip hop. And then I think about all on the West Coast, these incredible, powerful women contributing to hip hop in a variety of different ways, not just necessarily musically, but in other artistic ways as well. And this is something that I think I asked Tanya Willard about specifically in the chapter on Beat Nation.
Yeah.
And around what was at stake there and what was happening, that there was so much really exciting and political and strong contributions coming out, in particular by Indigenous women, both in the Salish, like on the West Coast, but also here within Saskatchewan. And so, and looking at those contributions, and then looking at the role modeling that happened within communities and, of course, across. And I know that Lindsay talks about Alita as one of her role models. And then, of course, Lindsay working with T-Runs, Tara Campbell, and now Lindsay being a role model for her. And so looking at how that the importance of the work that's being done, the recognition of these music pockets and contributions, I think is definitely key. And so it's really nice to hear, people opening up and becoming aware that the music making that happens is not just tied to these big, large urban centers that, tend to be recognized prominently. And so it's really nice to hear that opening up and our thoughtfulness about maybe, opening up and paying attention to the other areas, geographical areas. For me, it was when I heard people would talk to me about, this is quite early on in the work that I did, really hip hop happens there, and both in Regina in Saskatchewan, and then also in Nunavut. For example, when I was talking about hip hop that was going on in Iqaluit or in Pangasin or Arctic Bay, or it's people that it sort of was this wow factor, like how could this be?
Yeah.
So, we're not so isolated. I mean, there is isolation factors, but there is, like, it's this sense that, hip hop, we do have forms of mass media. Hip hop, it does, circulate, and also is compelling for people to either, like and enjoy to listen to, but also to create and to start to make it. And I think this is why we see, of course, hip hop too, an engagement with hip hop all over the world. It's, also tied to a kind of, well, here it is, there's a mimicry of what we hear, but then there's a way, and people are so creative and find ways to make it about their particular kind of local.
Yeah.
And bringing in that sort of local identity, creating hip hop that speaks truly to the experience of that particular place and those people. And that, whether it's through language or dance movements or, symbols within artwork or, whatever it is, it is a culture, and there are the arts practices associated with the culture of hip hop are there's ways to appropriate and adopt that are productive and exciting and innovative, and that's the kind of things that we are definitely seeing, or we have seen here And so it is good. It's also good to push back when people are, the suggestions of how hip-hop is read. For example, hip-hop in Nunavut, it was also read and thought about to me and talked to me about in the sense of, there's this very reified identity of what people living in the far north, that are in how they would appropriate or how they would take up hip hop, as opposed, in a very different kind of reading of what hip hop might look like in Regina, and particularly again that stereotype, the racialization of like mapping, gang culture and hip hop culture, and so there's been a lot of for one of the things that I was doing a lot early on in the work that I did was pushing back against that, and trying to disrupt those narratives in the circles that I was presenting the work that I was doing and engaging in the kinds of programs and projects that I was working with young people and also within communities, right? So that hip-hop does not necessarily equal this stereotype, but hip-hop. And then, that's when those artists and the community projects, that's where you see the richness of what hip-hop is and can be.
Yeah, specifically on that wow factor that you're mentioning, I've had that experience multiple times in my life, not only on working on this project and realizing that there were scenes in places like Saskatoon, for example, but even like I grew up in Ontario. I kind of lived all over in Ontario, but I grew up kind of close to the larger city, and I grew up in Ontario nevertheless, right? So I had this idea about what the country was like based off of a young kid's perspective in Ontario, and I ended up moving out to the Maritimes in my last year of high school. I think I was 16 or 17, and I moved out to Glace Bay, Nova Scotia. It's in Cape Breton Island, this kind of small off island on the outskirts of Nova Scotia, and it was very, very different to me. But when I first moved out here, I guess prior to moving out here, but knowing that I was going to, and I was going to end up making the trip, and that's where we're going to settle down as a family, I had a totally different perception of what Nova Scotia was going to be like compared to what it actually was when I got here. Even the thought of there being a university in Nova Scotia seemed foreign to me. I had this idea of it was going to be these houses on cliffs, and it was going to be very village-like, and everyone was going to be a fisherman, and it was going to be this kind of remote kind of weird landscape that is new to me and very, very different than what I saw going on in Ontario. Getting here, that's not the case at all. In fact, in some of the smaller towns that I lived in Ontario, it's very, very similar, and there's not much differences at all. And I feel like a lot of people kind of have that experience coming through. We at the house here, we have a weekly board game night, and we have a lot of Mormon missionaries that come through, and they come from all over the world, and their view of Nova Scotia is usually kind of on par with what mine was prior to coming here as well. I guess that to say is what, to kind of relate it back to what you were saying, when it comes to hip-hop culture, I feel like most people end up thinking of it as very kind of concrete landscapes, very urban, and that's where it takes place, right? You think of things like graffiti, you think of putting down your cardboard on a cement road or pavement so you can break dance. Like it's very urban in terms of setting, and it's very kind of industrial in terms of setting as well. Places like Saskatoon, where I think most people's perception of the prairies in general end up being kind of this farmland, or definitely when you look up in like Nunavut, for example, as you're mentioning, I think most people's, at least Canadians' perception of what it's like up there is just mostly snow and ice. So how is hip hop going to translate into those environments? And yeah, you see it translate pretty well. I think what Chaps and a few other people, I think Chadia was involved in that project as well, but they recently put out it was the Saskatoon Folk Rap Records. I think that's what it's called. I could be mistaken, but over the last year or two, they've released a number of a number of like 12 inches and just rap records in general that kind of speak to this prairie rap and this kind of unique subgenre that they've crafted for themselves based off of their own experience in the prairies. Exactly like you're saying, I think it's fascinating just to be able to see how hip-hop as an art form, as a culture, has been able to be translated into different environments, and then you're able to read what those translations are as kind of a way to understand better the culture that they live at their own region or their own locale. It's a really, really interesting kind of field of work. And yeah, I think this book kind of goes into that a lot. So yeah, there's a variety of subjects, I guess, covered within the book. So from like Toronto's dance culture to Canadian hip hop's representation in archives. I think we spoke of that a little bit prior to the podcast actually starting, to your work, both in indigenous, kind of the indigenous role in hip hop and the role women have played in our hip hop scene as well. I wanted to kind of start with that indigenous question first, mainly because we were kind of just talking about it, so it's a nice segue, but it's also the first chapter of yours that I had read within this book. So again, for those listening at home, you have a chapter in the book called Celebration, Resistance, and Action, Beat Nation, Hip Hop as Indigenous Culture. And one of the core themes here is that traditional indigenous modes of expression kind of work well within the confines of hip-hop expression, that these two worlds do not need to be separated. And when looking at indigenous hip-hop, we can see a blend of these styles, and again, kind of bringing us into that translation kind of idea. When were you first really made aware of not just indigenous hip-hop in Saskatchewan, because I think you kind of noted that, but specifically that there was kind of that translation effect at play when it came to mixing those two styles of expression, indigenous, kind of traditional indigenous style, and in hip-hop style, and those blending at play. When were you first made aware of that, and how?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that prior, let me think that through here. I would say when I moved to Saskatchewan, I think it's really important to note straight up that settler colonialism and indigenous relations and how those things play out look very differently in different parts of the country. And I think, although like the impacts and the effects and all of those things, there's certainly shared experiences, I think it looks very different. So coming from Toronto, what settler colonialism and like indigenous settler relations look like here was very different and very important to me and how I came and rethought my own relationship to Canada, to the lands on which I live, and my participation and my accountability as a white settler.
Yeah.
And that, perhaps you had that experience too, moving from Ontario, moving to a smaller, center in Nova Scotia. And of course, and I think it does look very different wherever you are. And I think that's also very key, because when I came to Regina, you start to see, for me, I started to see that within all kinds of cultural practices and forms, where there was a lot of mixing of different practices, whether it was, indigenous and hip-hop practices that we understand, quote unquote, like traditional kinds of practices. But which of course I think now, how we understand how things become indigenized, or how we understand how forms mix cultural practices. All of these kinds of things are so, we have certainly, I think, moved down a path where we can think about that in a more nuanced and rich way than just like two different practices coming together, but it's so much more rich and layered, and we see this actually all over the world, especially with hip hop. I think there's lots of possibilities there. But what I saw right away was the bringing together of hip hop. For example, people rapping in indigenous languages, for example, and that I think is really important to especially around the reclamation of languages that were stamped out or lost because of residential schools, because of colonization, all kinds of practices. But also I would say that one of the things that I think was so beautiful, it was a really nice moment. It's a moment I've written about, but where I was in Nunavut, I was there for the Alien Night Festival that happens in Iqaluit. I went to flew to Pengerton and was engaged in conversations with young people from that community and talking about hip hop for them, what it was for them, and they and two young women that went by, their names were B-Girl Annie and B-Girl Snap. At that time, there were young women there, and they this was 2007, maybe. It was quite early on for me in my practice on hip-hop, my research class on hip-hop, and where they stood together, and I initially thought they were going to, they asked to perform something for me, and I was very excited, and I assumed they were going to get up and rap or dance, but what ended up happening was the two of them stood together facing each other, and one began to throat sing and the other one began to beatbox. And so it was in that moment where they started talking about throat boxing. And these were very young girls, and of course this is something that has happened after that. I mean, we started to see it happening with artists doing this, and you think about all kinds of really interesting work that has been done around the art form. I'm thinking about the incredible work of Nêhiyawak, and just how throat singing, how it has evolved in various different ways and different forms. But it was a really important, lovely moment for me, for them to present this to me, and in a way that it challenged me and made me think about the sort of creativity and engagement of these very young people, and thinking about their how they were taking up hip hop in a way that for them in that moment made sense to them. And it was a really beautiful, lovely moment. And I just remember they were so excited to do it, but also very shy. But it was a lovely, one of those moments in my research career, in my life, that is just such a lovely moment of sharing something so beautiful and so simple, and yet so rich and taking on for them how they were enjoying hip hop in that moment. So I would say those things happen quite often, like those kinds of moments happen quite often.
Yeah.
And so how we understand expression and how we see it and the engagement of it is, and seeing kinds of new cultural forms being created are, obviously those, I think, are moments of intense excitement, innovation, joy, and certainly I've been very privileged to have a number of those moments happen in my life, thinking about hip hop in particular.
Yeah, the throat singing thing is particularly kind of beautiful, but it's so unique. I first became aware of the, I guess, practice and the art form by a colleague of mine that showed me some Mongolian throat singing, I guess, band, like a large, it seemed almost like a 20-piece band type thing. And it was so unique and creative to see kind of hip hop being used in these, I guess, various different ways, is fascinating. And I think a lot of people don't really end up seeing that because they're so used to being what's played on the radio, or just kind of what their preconceived notion of what hip hop is, that they're not really used to seeing hip hop practiced in new and creative ways. Which is kind of weird because hip hop is a very kind of regional and very geographic thing, right? So we think of New York hip hop being very distinct and separate from Atlanta hip hop or from LA hip hop, Bay Area hip hop having a very unique sound to it. But I feel like people don't really prescribe cultural differences to that same sort of reality, right? They see it in terms of geographics, like geography, and that there's going to be different sounds correlating with different areas, but not necessarily because of cultural reasons. And I think that becomes a lot more evident when you look at specific cultural groups like indigenous populations within Nunavut or in Regina or what have you, and see how they articulate that hip hop expression and just see it play out so differently from what else is around them. I think that's amazingly cool and just interesting. And I think it's something worthy of exploration. I think the more you kind of dig into kind of local hip hop, the more interesting those kind of pockets become. I haven't experienced that Nunavut kind of throat singing hip hop that you're referring to. But even just hearing you describe it makes me want to take the time out to go and kind of dive into that whole new realm of music and art. But no, I totally see what you're saying. I think it's amazing.
I also think, one of the things it's interesting, right? Because yes, there's like a particular sound that is attached, a hip hop sound or an aesthetic, something that's attached to often certain regions. And I think that's one of the things that's really been important too over the last decade for me, or 15 years, is to really think about and articulate, I don't talk about indigenous hip hop, but hip hop through an indigenous lens, or even how they Beat Nation, right? That hip hop as indigenous culture, and just the diversity and creative differences across indigenous communities. And so when we talk about hip hop and sort of these, how it's, as I'm drawing on your word there, translated within various different communities, it's so often so different and so unique and so much a part of that particular local, whether it's the vernacular, whether it's, the artwork, whether the aesthetic, the fashion, whatever it is. And I think that was one of the really important pieces that I loved about Beat Nation. And so, of course, Beat Nation was a project. Tanya Willard and Stina Reese, they were the co-curators. I mean, it's talked about in the book at length. I really quote a lot from Tanya because her words are so, I think, important to understanding that larger project. But within that, it really, there were representatives from a lot of different places. And I think that was really exciting and showed the variety of innovation and engagement and difference all over. And that was for me, when I came upon that online exhibition, I found it so compelling in a variety of different ways and demonstrative of what people can do with hip hop. So I really, it was, to me, it's still up. It's a project that happened a long time ago, but it's still there. The online exhibition is still there, and it's there's so much material and really great artwork across the disciplines there as well.
Yeah, there's I have the book here in front of me, and there's a number of parts in I guess, in the entirety of the text that I've highlighted, but I did highlight one specific quote from Tanya that I think kind of speaks to this issue. She says, I was really wary that people were going to see it and be like, quote, oh, Native kids doing new things. It's all about new. But it's not about that. It's about seeing this continuum of their culture and incorporating a holistic idea of who they are as Indigenous person, as an Indigenous person that doesn't have to be divorced from Indigenous contemporary realities. I think that's a kind of a beautiful quote, and you're right. You do end up quoting her a lot in this chapter, but I think they're appropriate quotes at the very least. And she's. I have never spoken to Tanya. And again, for those listening at home, it's Tanya Willard. But I've never spoken to her, but she's seems to be a very good speaker at the very least, and the ideas that she presents within this chapter alone are quite thought provoking.
Tanya is a brilliant artist, and this piece, I mean, this is just another one of the elements that she is very strong at in this curation. So she's an artist in her own right, and then curates, which of course is another kind of art form. And to curate online, this was early on, so these online exhibitions, it was fairly new. I think Canada Heritage, it was funded through that program, which is no longer, but was indeed a way to think about also connecting people all over the world, and exhibiting in a way at a time where it didn't necessarily make sense to be thinking about, for example, an exhibition on hip hop.
Yeah.
In a formal gallery. Yes, of course, it happened, and it can happen, and there's lots of work that's been done, I think, by some galleries, to revitalize. But I need to connect to an entire generation of people that, visiting galleries in the sort of those kind of conventional ways, that would not be the thing. And so to, take these works and all of the different platforms, right? So it's certainly music, but it's fashion, and it's dance performances, and it's poetry, and it's beats, and it's all of these different elements, and putting them onto a platform that is accessible all around the world, and probably, perhaps I would argue, more innovative in a way of like attracting young people to an exhibit was really key at that time. And as I said, yes, there's been a lot of critique of what that means and how to think about that now, and some work being done on what it means, like how to make galleries and centers where these kinds of exhibitions can happen more accessible in ways that maybe would get in more generations, because of course we saw the decline, right? A decline in who is, and not a very diverse group of people maybe going to galleries in the same way. And so how can we address that? And I think this project did a really great job of that, and it also was able to capture the beauty of what hip hop was through this Indigenous lens.
You mentioned that you don't use the term Indigenous hip hop there, and I think that that's interesting in of itself. But there's this connection between activism and Indigenous hip hop that I want to kind of touch on. And I feel that there's often this notion that the term kind of Indigenous hip hop implies that artists must be political in order to kind of honor their heritage or their culture. And there's this political notion kind of tied to it, and that by using Indigenous hip hop as a label, we are implying kind of a sort of activism onto it. I'm not sure personally how to feel about that, as I guess we wouldn't necessarily say like African American hip hop must be in its nature political, even though there are political African American artists. Perhaps it's because it's not, and we are aware as a society that it's not, because we're inundated with different forms of African American hip hop music. But there's I think that there's a difference there, at least in terms of what people end up kind of thinking of when they hear the term indigenous hip hop, and what that's going to end up meaning, and what that's going to sound like, and what the content of that music is going to end up sounding or going to end up being. How do you end up feeling about this? Do you see that indigenous hip hop artists kind of have an obligation to speak on these issues? Do you think there's a space for indigenous hip hop outside of the political sphere? I know I keep using the term indigenous hip hop, but I think it's important for this context at the very least.
I think one of the things I need to say is I'm not going to speak for artists, for hip hop artists. Sure. And I think that's really key. I'm also, as a settler, as someone who's white, I need to be very conscientious of my relationship, of who I am in this place, and also as a researcher. And this is something really, I think, I've been doing this research since 2004, but at that time there were not, I think maybe there had been one or two articles in total published around hip hop, and one was, I think, on Bannock in Edmonton. There was and another one maybe coming out of Quebec. I can't. So and we know that part of that, there's a lot of systemic issues around who is in universities and what colonization has, been responsible for. And so I think one of the things I'm really excited about is that over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a real rise of number of folks that are engaged in this research, like junior scholars, and I think and excited by it and engaged, and I'm really thrilled to have participated early on, and I'm also really excited that for me, in that sense, I know that I step back and not allow. I just step back at this point, and that's really exciting. But that being said, so coming back to this very specific question, I would say in hip hop, a lot of artists that I have spoken to, want to be understood and recognized for and celebrated for their hip hop. Like, they are hip hop artists first and foremost. And what that means, and we've heard this not just around how people categorize or distinguish, but certainly we've heard this in other areas, especially like the gendering. I'm a female, and
the femc
rather than
thing,
I'm just an MC.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, this is a very problematic way of thinking about and talking about artists and their work, because it becomes, but it's like a double-edged sword, because one, it's really important to have role models that are from marginalized groups, right? That makes total sense. We need more women MCs. We need more women dancers, that people who do or be girls. We need to see that more because of the exclusion, because of the historical inequality and even just gendering of public and private space, all of those things, the gendering of hip hop that still happens, like that heavily masculinized identity that is mapped on to hip hop. Of course, we need to see that broken up, and we need to see people, diversity within hip hop. But I think it's also really important to value the contributions, the music, the artwork of these artists as hip hop artists, too. And I it's often it's interesting because, of course, then it's often those folks that have already been marginalized that end up having to carry the burden of doing all of the labor around social justice. And this is, I've talked about this even in my work in Girls Rock, Regina, for example, like in the Girls Rock scene, and how it is that, the expectation, the people doing the labor around social justice and around that work, to combat exclusionary practices in local music scenes, not just hip-hop, and many local music scenes, like diversifying who's on stage, who's in lineups, who's asked, engaging and thinking about the problems or the automatic assumptions when you're talking to a band and everyone goes, the tech folks go to the men in the band as opposed to a woman who is actually it's her band. These are just the kinds of things that happen over and over and over again across. And these are the kinds of things that need to be combated and worked against. And people, again, we constantly need to do that education. And, but that work tends to still happen by the folks that are marginalized, those are the ones that end up doing that labor. And that's a problem, right? And this is the same thing when we look at things like Black Lives Matter. We look at what kinds of practices are happening in reconciliation, like who's doing the hard labor, and who needs to be, right? And who should be doing that work. Whether it's, you're the accomplice or the ally, who should be? It's the people that are privileged that need to be doing that work, and much more of that labor. And so I think there's been a push around that, certainly in the last 6 to 8 months around how do you do the work if you are privileged, and how can you actually help make sustainable and real change that has a positive impact, and how can you do that work in a way that is ethical and true, and all of these kinds of things. So I would say when we talk about hip-hop, I think hip-hop artists have they can make whatever kind of hip-hop they want. I think one doesn't, just because you're a hip-hop artist, we've seen this, we know this, it doesn't necessarily mean you're political, it doesn't necessarily mean you're progressive, and this is one of the ongoing issues we see within that genre, like that hyper-masculinity, the over-sexualization of women, the homophobia, we continue to see that. And we continue to see a kind of glorification of capitalism. Like we see these narratives that are quite typical and stereotypical and boring and just awful. But we and I think that's one of the things in working on hip hop that sometimes can become very tiring. I've had to answer that question a lot in talking about the research, especially when I've been working with youth and young people, and why are we drawing on hip hop? Like there's all these things, or even seeing how, as I think I mentioned this earlier, how those narratives can play out where just because it's hip hop, then all of a sudden it becomes mediated through a lens of gang culture, for example. And that happens often, especially around Indigenous youth, especially around young men. In the city, for example. And so we need to, those are things that, like, we have to be very conscientious of and think about. And so I think that, it's a bit of that's one of those hard things, because you have someone, I'm coming back to this, I'm going this roundabout way, coming back to this question, when you have an artist like Paul, who is and proud of her indigeneity and her mixed ancestry, and yet and raps in her language, in Cree to some extent, is trying to reclaim that, and yet at the same time is an incredible MC who raps fast and hard, and she is so talented. She is a talented hip hop artist, and so I think there's something to be said for that. But also she acknowledges and recognizes that that this is one of the issues that comes up for her to think, and that she has to respond to and think about a lot. And I've asked those questions too of her. And so, like in that sense, like, what does it mean and how do you understand your place, especially as a woman rapper that raps progressive kinds of raps, social justice, and then thinking about and even asking this about that beautiful project that she and T. Rhyme just did around By Women for Women, which is around the supporting of other women within the hip hop scene and role modeling and encouraging and all of those kinds of things. Such an important project.
Yeah, there's a number of things there. Thank you for the insight in terms of the burdening kind of aspect. I never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. This idea that we're almost prescribing an obligation towards minority groups and people that are actually undergoing the oppression in order to actually do something about it and to speak up and to be activists. But that burden probably shouldn't be on them. And I've always understood that I guess let's say white people or the oppressors or the historical oppressors do need to do more than what they're currently doing 100%. But there most certainly is an obligation societally in order for the oppressed to be kind of activists and to speak up. You hear this all the time, even in terms of kind of public celebrities and the depending on the categories that they're kind of placed in, you often end up hearing kind of backlash because they're not speaking out on specific issues that they should be based off of their background. But yeah, you're absolutely right about that burdening idea, and I never quite thought of it in those terms or articulated it in that way. So thank you. So there's a few different chapters that you ended up kind of contributing to, and I want to end up moving on to something else here. But you wrote a chapter, the last chapter in the collection actually, on a particular conference that took place within the Rain City Rap Festival in Vancouver a number of years back. And I feel like that's probably been, I think, touched on now a couple times within this conversation. But the conference title was Clear Lines, Powerful and Fierce Women in Hip Hop, and it featured a number of female hip hop practitioners that contributed in some way to the conversation of women in hip hop. From one of the photos included in the chapter, I thought I saw yourself in that kind of photo, meaning that you were in the panel as well. Can you tell those listening how this panel came together and what your role or what role you had to play in the conference or in the specific panel was?
Yes, so I had been 2 years prior to that. I had been invited by Elaine Carroll, who is part of Miscellaneous Productions, the artistic director and organizer of this event. So the first one was Rain City Rap, and it was a history of rap and hip hop in Vancouver specifically. And so that was really exciting. I came and I moderated a couple of panels for that one, all of like very sort of important big figures in hip hop there, having discussions that were specifically from that region. Yep. And I gave a talk on how we might think about archiving and histories of hip hop across, because of the diversity and also the nature of them, and also what ended up happening after that was that I ended up meeting Mark at a different conference in actually on the East Coast in Nova Scotia. Mark and I met. Marie Foreman connected us, and learned all about Northside Hip Hop, which I think is the digital archiving of cultures like of hip hop makes so much more sense, and I think that work is brilliant and really important work. And I'm quite a strong supporter of Mark's work and all that goes into that archive, and his engagement especially over the last few years to diversify that so it's not so focused on Toronto, which was the initial, but really branching out and trying to archive and think about hip-hop histories all over the country. And I think that's key and exciting. So that was, I believe that was in 2011 maybe. And then it was a biannual event at that time. It became for one session. And Elaine invited me, asked me if I would like to participate again a little bit differently in the second one. So it was in 2013. And one, it was to do 2 public interviews, one with Chin and Jetty and one with Lita Kinistar. And then the other was to moderate this panel of women hip-hop participants. And they all have different roles. They all are, well, I suppose there were 2 rappers on there, but the way they participate in hip-hop was very different. And it was very exciting, and I really got to, begin by throwing out and asking them this question that I had sent before, and it was really around thinking about the work, the labor, the work, and how we think about hip-hop, especially as women participating in a culture that is still bound within so many of those other issues I talked about, right? Like, what does it mean to be doing and making hip-hop and working against still a very particular kind of status quo and some very problematic things like the sexism, the hypermasculinity, the homophobia, the capitalization, sort of the seductiveness of that sort of slick celebrity kind of culture. And so that was in the initial question I put out to them, and then we just got to go around and have this incredibly rich conversation and it was a conversation that, although from 2013, is still incredibly relevant today, which on one hand is, exciting because the book just came out, and so people are engaged in this, reading this lovely, this important conversation that happened, and yet at the same time, disheartening that it's still so relevant, right? And so that's how it came about. It was really to have all of those diverse voices coming from, whether it was, JB the First Lady, so rapping, contributing in so many ways within community work, to having Kim and Kia, the dancing and like someone coming out of the hip-hop dance scene in a variety of different, both local and sort of more national, international. Kia, like rapping to such beautiful reflection. Andrea, who had, as a journalist and writer, writing about this and engaging and thinking about hip-hop in all kinds of ways. And Tara, like this incredible pioneer DJ. They all had very unique perspectives, and yet there were lots of common themes and shared experience that we were able to think about. And one of the things that I thought was so exciting, and when I go through this work again, when I read this chapter, I'm very proud of this particular piece because of that innovation and the strategies within which they all talked about. And they all talked about very different kinds of strategies, how they managed or negotiated or shut down the kinds of, sexism or exclusionary practices that they were facing with such creativity and finesse. They were just like these awesome, beautiful moments where I was, you're just blown away and you're just like, oh, that's such a thoughtful and smart and savvy way to deal with some of this. And I think so for me, it was also indicative of the innovativeness of these people and how they were engaging and how they continue to contribute and give culture.
Yeah, there was one strategy in particular that really stood out to me, and it's probably the one you're thinking of right now as well, but and I forget exactly who it was, so you can enlighten me there, but it was a journalist anyhow, and what she had done is anytime that she was asked to do an interview or cover somebody that was particularly misogynistic or particularly troubling in terms of their own politics and the way that they carry themselves, she would kind of structure the interview that she was instructed to do with this person as not confrontational, but subject-wise, it would be entirely about that topic, but almost looking at it kind of positively. So there was an example given where she was asked to interview this rapper that was very kind of misogynistic, and as he came through town, she phrased the interview in terms of how did you think about your like, what do you think about your mother, for example, or like who are your favorite women role models, and asking these kind of questions that completely turn the table on the individual to kind of address some of his own misogynistic views or his own views on women, and maybe give the listener maybe a different kind of lens of who that person really is, and maybe allow the artist also to kind of reflect on a lot of those kind of ideas. I also thought that was really savvy and really interesting. I do a lot of interviews myself, and I don't think I would be that confident in order to carry through with something like that. I think I'd be a nervous wreck hopping into an interview knowing that that's what I was going to do. But I think it was extremely powerful, and I'd love to be able to see some of her work in action and actually see that happen, because I think it was super creative and very daring and very kind of courageous, and I don't know, just an awesome way of handling that issue. So yeah, I don't know. That stood out to me too. Okay.
Yeah, that was Andrea Warner, and Andrea's brilliant. She's written a number of books, and specifically around popular music and women. She's just authored the Buffy St. Marie, the authorized biography, just came out last year. Anyway, she's incredible and smart and savvy, and I know I was very compelled by that, and compelled by others. The way they just took it up and was like, no, like Tara, yeah. I think in some, no, that's not going to work. This is how it's going to work, and just just shut it down in a way that made it like this. No, we're not playing. I'm not playing the game this way. We're moving on to this, and this is how it's going to be. And yeah,
I loved it. I thought it was great, and thank you for including that little bit in the chapter as well, because it added. I don't know. It made the chapter more enjoyable and more interesting, thought-provoking.
Yeah, I think that how these women are contributing, and the ways that they contribute, and the way that they end up impacting, and many of the participants on this panel, right, are engaged in community work, teaching youth, young people, and if that's the kind of role modeling that's happening at that moment in those sort of developmental stages, that's important for creating change.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think even, for example, one of the hip hop projects. So I had mentioned Scott Collegiate as the high school that I ended up doing this lovely hip hop project for 6 years, I think it was, where we created a curriculum of, where young people, grade 10s, they came to the university, to the imp labs. We did this back and forth, and they learned the hip-hop elements. And part of that, through that, they were able to get English credits. They were able to get arts education credits, health credits. And part of the issue there was it was grade 10, and the students moved through up to grade 10, and then once they hit grade 10, they had to pass. So you were moved through, didn't matter where you were at, but once they got to grade 10, they had to pass. And what was happening is they found at this particular high school during this moment was in time, not now, I don't know what's happening now specifically, but what they were seeing was a lot of, in particular, young men falling off and not concluding. And so one of the reasons that I was approached was, can we come up and do a project where they can get these credits through hip hop elements. And so we did. We worked very hard, created a kind of curriculum, developed this project, and we saw success. But one of the things that I did to mitigate this kind of hyper masculinity and the sort of notoriety of hip hop and the sort of gendered, the sexist problems that were, are very much part of the mainstream culture of the culture and represented in media, etc., is that I hired for my imp-lab assistants, my research assistants, the team was all women. And they were all women it was a diverse group of women that all had incredible skills. So on the technology. And so what I found was there was a real deconstruction or a real disruption of this idea that the sort of the gendering of technologies as being, very, male-oriented around expertise, but also these young people having to talk, especially these young men, having to be mentored and engage with these savvy, talented women around issues of hip-hop and creating their raps and creating their beats and creating their DJ sets and learning how to dance and thinking about hip-hop in that way with these very strong women mentors. And I think that was a really important choice and forward-thinking, I don't know, one of those strategies that for me was key in sort of breaking down a lot of those stereotypes, especially for these young men that were in grade 10, that were really, caught up in that sort of seductive, like, hip-hop style that was so mainstream and so, like, particular. And it challenged them, and they worked through a lot of really interesting things. We really challenged any kind of notion of, like, lyrics that were gendered and sexist, or how representations of particular kinds of beats or sounds, and it worked. And we saw on that level there was a real movement there, and a recognition and a kind of respect that was so generated and earned, and so there was such a reciprocity there, and that was another one of those lovely moments that I have been privileged to be part of and see.
Yeah. One of the themes that kept popping up within the conversation of the panel, at the very least, and within the confines of the chapter, was that of kind of commercial hip hop and mainstream hip hop, and the separation between quote unquote authentic hip hop culture and what is being played on the radio, shown in MTV music videos, presented in kind of hip hop advertising, etc. Kia Kadiri, one of the women in the panel, and a fantastic hip hop artist, one of my favorites from Vancouver. Actually, I think she's from Victoria originally, but she noted that she refuses to listen to mainstream rap and has a hard time justifying her kind of hip hop identity. I think in kind of part due to this. Can you elaborate on this theme, and I guess why it was chosen as something, I guess, so crucial to your own reflection of the conference and of the panel that you attended, and I guess moderated?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things too, and I mentioned this before, is like that problem of thinking about commercial as bad and underground as good or progressive, because of course we see some of the most misogynist, awful, problematic hip-hop in underground as well, right? So I think, and certainly in mainstream, we've seen some brilliant feminist, just activist kinds of hip-hop as well. So it's really important, I think, not to get caught up in the binary, but it is important because I think what was the experience of these people, and I would argue my experience as well, is what you do get to hear on commercial radio is so it's very much the same, right? It's the same, not very. And so when there is that mainstream, an artist that breaks through that, where there is something different about it, I mean, people are wowed and excited. But at the same time, I think for this group, there was a real struggle too around, like, what does it take to become commercial? Like, what kind of hoops, and where are they willing to draw lines? And I think Kia was really important with that, in thinking about even, like, I didn't want to listen to that because it also wasn't for her, that idea that there was an inauthenticity. That wasn't her lived experience. So why would she take on some of that, some of those symbols and ideas that are connected to hip-hop specifically, to do that? And I really appreciated that. I appreciated that sense of, like, honesty around, I didn't want to become, something that I wasn't, because that wasn't my experience. And I think her experience, her racialized experience, was very different. And I really appreciated how she talked about that in Victoria, like that idea of, like, well, there wasn't even like, when you're only one, like, there isn't a shared, so you can't engage in these kinds of experiences. It's a little bit different how you experience racism, and racial difference, and and then the same, Tara talked a little bit about that as well, coming from PI, right? And so being one, like, the kinds of racism that you experience are a little bit are different. And I thought it was really lovely how they also both enrich, how they both were worked to articulate what that meant to each of them. And then, of course, Tara, right, also talking about being queer. And then, and so there's a sense of that. And so I think it really did come up, because I think a lot, too, is like, who do you see in the commercial? How can one, within commercial rap and hip-hop, who's represented there? Does one see themselves there? Often not. And then, so whether it's quote unquote authentic rap or authentic hip hop, or ways of participating and being that seem to be more connected to one's experience, I think that a number of the artists on the panel did a really good job of trying to get at those very complex and nuanced differences and experiences, and trying to articulate what they mean and how it happens. And so, again, coming back to that, and them recognizing that, of course, like, there's some really great, artists that are successful commercially, but at the same time, it wasn't their experience to see a lot of that.
I found it interesting. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I find it interesting that that Kia had, as you said, kind of refused to adopt some of the symbols that were, I guess, not her, right? So outside of her own personality and how she would normally act, she refused to change the way she was in order to adopt kind of hip-hop verbiage, cadence, the way she carried herself, etc. What I find interesting is that, for the most part, and I maybe took totally, but she has remained authentic to hip hop, right? She's from Victoria, but from British Columbia and the kind of Vancouver kind of hip hop scene anyhow. And I've interviewed over 100 people within that scene in Vancouver and Victoria. And I can't count the number of times that her name has come up in conversation, and the accolades, the praise, the respect that Kia ends up getting within the community, despite her not having to change who she is and not having to kind of conform to the standards of hip-hop. I find that fascinating, that she's still been able to adhere that much respect and is still clearly considered authentic when it comes to her own expression of hip-hop culture. she's an incredibly talented individual, but I think the acceptance there to some degree speaks to something. I'm not saying hip hop is completely accepting, because I know it's not, and even within these localized cultures, I've heard stories about how it's the opposite of that. But it's interesting that Kia has been able to create art within this sphere and still be respected despite not changing who she is, in ways that are very confrontational to how hip-hop is supposed to be, quote-unquote supposed to be.
I would, yes. Like, the one thing I would say is Kia's super talented. She's also incredibly generous in how she's given and back to the community, how she does workshops and programs and teaching, and how she supports others. And this is also one of the things that I was hoping and trying to get at in that last chapter, is the kinds of generosity and labor that are put into hip hop at this grassroots level, and that kind of work that is done by so many women artists is something that needs to be recognized, acknowledged, celebrated, and really taken into account when we're talking about hip-hop histories, how hip-hop continues to move and circulate, the kinds of innovation that's happening with hip-hop. That's the labor that needs to be, recognized and acknowledged, and so often is not in these larger conversations, within the discourses, within how hip-hop histories are articulated and published and mediated. And I think, that's one thing we did attempt, and I think it's also one of the reasons when Mark and I, with this book, we really did initially have a number of other very, interviews with artists. And it was something we were both very committed to, and that was a negotiation with the press around how the shape of the book. And these are things that, this is a particular kind of book. It has to fit in some of the frames. And so we were able to keep the interview with Drew Daly in the book. And then we reference a lot of the other interviews, and that those interviews are actually housed on
Northside Hip Hop Archive.
So on the archive. Yeah, in the archive. So that, we can reference them, and we did throughout in different places. And it's the same, that initially, that chapter on Beat Nation, that was a really beautiful interview with Tanya. But when it was that, you either rewrite some into chapters and so that was a way we were able to keep that focus on the artists as well, the makers, right? Those are doing the work, and it's the same, that the quoting in that last chapter, bringing together the theme. It's hopefully pulling these voices up, giving a platform to these voices, and the work that's being done. But I think that's something that it's missing a lot, is that we don't look to what's happening at that level, at the grassroots level there, because of course, it's not. And this is the problem with music industry, with thinking about celebrity nature of music and music making, is that we miss out on moments. And so to do that work and to look further, it's also one of the things that I teach at university in the popular music courses that I teach, whether it's hip hop or whatever it is. It's here's an assignment that you need to go and do some digging. Get in there and listen and and seek out that which is not so readily available. And overall, students come back, saying that was the best project I had to do. It was really hard, but it was like, wow, and that's that. And I think as the general public, as listeners, we need to be doing that work too. So whatever we can do to include those contributions, to recognize those contributions, and to celebrate them as like key to the thriving hip hop communities and scenes that are happening. That's what we need to be doing when we're writing about and talking about hip hop.
Yeah. I know we're well past the original hour mark that we had said, but there's a couple other things that I would like to kind of go into if you have time.
Sure. Let's. We should wrap it up fairly soon, but
okay.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll try to be also more concise.
Fair enough. You bring up a quote from Trisha Rose in the chapter, in the last chapter there, and although I don't have the quote here in front of me, it's essentially suggests that hip hop's not dead, but it is indeed very ill. You suggest that hip hop in Canada and these women that attended that panel specifically kind of offer an antidote to that sickness. I've read Trisha's work, and I think she's an incredible scholar, but for a lot of people in the culture, I think they see your point. Hip-hop has had its transformations over the years, but there's still this active pocket that is not necessarily caving into the pressures of, I guess, toxic hip-hop culture. We not only have the women in your panel, but a large chunk of the hip-hop community kind of committed to values of social justice and progressive values. This is where I would apply, I guess, that authentic hip-hop culture label if I apply it anywhere. Do you see hip-hop getting better? I know that's a question that gets asked all the time, but do you see it getting better? And do you see the occasional conscious artists like J. Cole or Kendrick Lamar, or the growing acceptance of a rapper like Rhapsody, for example, kind of adding to this conversation?
I would say for sure there's a number of artists that are adding to the conversation and doing making hip hop, and not just on the rapping and emceeing, but like even in other art forms, right, that are part of or have been part of the culture. I would say definitely, is hip hop getting better? Was that the actual question? Is hip hop getting better?
Is hip hop getting better? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I would. As someone who's been writing a long time, sometimes you can say what hip hop does, and I would say, as someone who has been constantly articulating hip hop as a place where I see and have had the honor and privilege of participating with youth, where they are engaging in hip-hop arts forms, and able to, through these forms, able to articulate very complex lived experiences. They are able to, find a voice or a means to communicate and engage politically, to engage in a kind of activism that's meaningful to them and their communities. I would say on that level, there's so much about hip hop that is significant, is real, is important. I see that there are a number of artists that I would suggest are doing such incredible, awesome work around decolonization, around kinds productive and ethical or more real kinds of reconciliation or conciliation, as opposed to, maybe what the lip service that we're seeing paid, perhaps in so many other venues and avenues. But I would, overall, I think hip-hop is still very much bound up within this sort of capitalist enterprise of, and I think that there needs to be some very big and, have like a revolt, I suppose, around the music industry and capitalism and celebrity culture, and how, these structures maintain and perpetuate a particular kind of narrative and narratives. And so I certainly see and hear artists doing that work as we have in the past. But I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily certain that, hip hop is getting better
Fair.
in that sort of political way. But I think my hope is that the work that's being done in the grassroots to challenge some of those structures, the labor that's being done there is having an impact and an effect. And perhaps what that means is that there will be some larger systemic change. How long it will take to see that, I'm not sure. But I think, again, there are those of us in positions of power and privilege that have a way or a voice or means to articulate some of these other more innovative and social justice-minded and more interesting kinds of work, and to give a platform and a voice. That's key. I also think it's up to the listeners, people who engage, that we have to do work. And I think, we need to be more savvy in how we listen, who we listen to, the work we do, in order to find artists that are not necessarily commercial or mainstream. Those are the kinds of things the kind of good work that we actually, as a public, can do. We can do that work. And so to acknowledge that we can do that work and then do it, that's, I think, again, another strategy, another way forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure we could talk about this issue for quite a while, but ultimately I think I agree with your sentiments. I have one last question here before I let you end up going. As I read through the text, and that being the collection as a whole, and specifically your contributions, you make a number of statements towards, I guess, the purpose of the collection as a whole, and the work that was done by other contributors within the collection as well, from the idea that hip-hop is negatively portrayed in the media, and by looking at this kind of more honest look at how hip-hop culture really is experienced, we can begin to shift or reimagine how we look at hip-hop as a culture, to this idea that kind of Canadian hip-hop particularly is understudied and underappreciated, and this collection can serve as a way to kind of instill value into our own contributions as a country. Now that this book has obviously been published, and I'm sure you've started to get some feedback on the works, how do you kind of see the purpose for this book now, in the first week of 2021?
Well, I would say that I am happy, or let me think that through. I think the book has value in that it's going to, and it is opening doors or avenues, sites into different kinds of hip hop that is happening across, or all around Canada, and that there's, much more to Canadian hip hop than Drake, for example, which is,
Sure.
What ends up happening, especially, in the mainstream, is like, we become recognized for those artists that make it that are commercially successful.
Yes.
And I think, we know, and people, if they think about that at all, know, and that's not all there is. But I think what this book is suggesting and contributing to is that there's a rich diversity of hip hop makers and hip hoppers all over this country, and that there are many stories being told through hip hop and through the hip hop, all the different arts associated with hip hop culture, and that there is a great offering here of diverse voices and experiences and knowledge that is worthwhile to get to know and to listen to and to engage with. And that's, I think, at the sort of bottom, the foundation of what Mark and I were attempting to do. We certainly could not offer a full history or a full representation of all of the hip hop, cultures, identities, scenes,
of course,
events going on, because there are so many. And I think that's the other thing that's really key, is that there are particular kinds of hip hop happening in Canada that isn't happening elsewhere, and that's important too, and important to recognize. And so, whether it's thinking about the diaspora and how that works within Canada, thinking about that, especially in some of the chapters that's very much engaged, and others the sort of what does it mean for Indigenous voices and thinking about hip-hop through an Indigenous lens, and why that's so rich and important, especially at this place, at this moment, after and thinking about, the truth and reconciliation, the murdered and missing Indigenous women, all of these very important conversations and hopefully actions that are happening to think and to work through these ongoing historical and ongoing injustices. I think these are where a lot of rich conversations are happening, and to me it makes sense to be looking to the arts, and in particular looking to hip hop, especially if you're interested in looking and listening to young people and their voices and their stories.
Beautiful. I can't thank you enough again for taking the time out to speak to me here. I've enjoyed reading the text immensely. I recommend it to anyone listening. And your contributions to it remain insightful and thought-provoking. So again, thank you. I'd love to have you back on again when future work is being published. 100%. I would love to have you back on this podcast sometime in the future, whenever it feels appropriate anyhow. For those listening at home, can you tell the people where they can find a copy of We Still Hear, Hip Hop North of the 49th Parallel, where they can pick it up?
For sure. Hopefully your local bookstore would have it. I know that for us that's really key. But you can certainly, it's hard to know where to say this because everybody is all over the place. But hopefully your local bookstore would have it. And also, you can find it online. I don't want to, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. How about that? Would that be okay?
That's more than
Alex,
sufficient.
I don't want to tout like Amazon or anything. So,
That's fair. I followed a number of authors within 2020. 2020 that we're very adamant about not promoting Amazon links to their publications, despite their presses insisting that it be on those portals. So I fully understand and see where you're coming from. But yes, thank you so much again for coming on. It's been a blast of a conversation. Hopefully you've enjoyed this as well. This is my favorite thing to do, is to talk about hip hop history, and just hip hop studies in general. And to be able to have these conversations on a regular basis is a blessing. So thank you.